The other day, I was working on understanding Savitri with a friend, and I began to speak to her of my understanding thus far of this great epic. And she said, "Oh, you must tell everyone about this." Well, when that intuition comes, it's not always so easy to tell everyone about it in the same way, but I will try just for a couple of minutes. Savitri is a global experience. It cannot be reduced to lines and phrases and words and definitions. They are all, no doubt, a part of it, but even more, what is behind them is this genius of a divine poet who has received from the highest realms the word, the actual word. And that word expressed in Savitri in iambic pentameter is the key to all of us in our inner progress. But the word also contains music, and especially it contains rhythm. So when we scan a line, and we should scan lines often, we don't want to always repeat something in short, long, short, long, short, long, because it would become boring. So the poet changes things, but basically it is iambic pentameter, short, long. And in iambic pentameter, we have naturally 5 beats in the line. Life kept no more a dull and meaningless shape. And that is an anapest, meaningless, when you get 3 beats into one. We won't go into the structure of poetry very much, but those couple of things are very important. That we don't drop the sound of our voice at the end of a line, nor do we raise it. There were some people in the ashram who would raise it, and that would become not too pleasant at times. Mother has tried different inflections in Savitri, and we can use those also. But we don't want to over-accent any word. A slight accent. The last thing I'd like to share with you is what is called enjambment. Enjambment is when a line is carried over into another line. The phrase is carried over into another line. We may come up with one, and if we do, I will point it out to you. But usually in Savitri, we don't have enjambed lines. They're things in themselves. But as they are something in themselves, they are also connected with all the other lines in that phrase. Sri Aurobindo mentions in his letters on Savitri that sometimes he has used 2 and 3 and 4 lines in one phrase, but actually after that time we find that he sometimes uses 7 and more. So there was an edition of Savitri that broke up the entire book into complete sentences. And it was an interesting experiment, certainly an interesting experiment, but maybe a little overdone, but still worthwhile. So we begin on what line is it now? the divine dwarf.
Yes.
Now, the last thing I wanted to speak about, and I have talked about it previously, is that Sri Aurobindo very often capitalizes words. And they are so important, or he would not have capitalized them. So we have to pay attention to them. So this first line, the divine dwarf towered to unconquered worlds. Well, I have interviewed many people on this divine dwarf. And so I'd like to share with you a few of them. Okay, the first one, Amal. Amal says, the divine dwarf is the psychic being in its initial state. Nolini says, it is the divine as Vamana, as someone doing austerities. Madhav Pandit says, the allusion is to Vamana avatar, to the Vamana avatar in Indian mythology. Vamana the dwarf, Lilliputian in form, asks for a boon of 3 steps of land from the king. The king readily agrees. Suddenly the dwarf assumes a stupendous shape and occupies both the worlds of earth and heaven, and asks where he should place his 3rd step. The king is obliged to offer his head. The Titan yields to the divine in the form of Vamana. In the book of the Divine Mother, we hear the living divine person in Ashwapati, finding earth too trifling, exceeds it, and grows larger and larger, higher and higher, to encompass the unconquered worlds above. And then we have last Purani. The dwarf here brings to our mind the Vamana, the divine dwarf, an incarnation of Vishnu, who measured the 3 worlds, the material, the vital, and the mental. So we see that it's a symbolic approach in the Veda, enlarged as usual. And this is from Purani's book, Savitri, An Approach and a Study. Vladimir, can you add anything else to these great voices? We would love to hear from you.
Well, it's a well-known myth, as we know, of Vamana, Avatara, who was born there and who asked for just as little as 3 steps of earth from the Asura who was ruling the world. He was already kind of suspicious about something is going to happen, but I think this is the vision of the psychic being, and it's coming forward, yes, as Vamana Purusha is actually that Angushtamatra Purusha Hridi Guhayam, in the heart of the cave of the heart, who comes out and then enlarges itself, as Sri Aurobindo says, in spiritual transformation to embrace the whole world, and then even going beyond into the transcendental, supramental, opening the gates to the transcendental force. So basically these 3 steps of growing psychic, becoming the Lord of the creation, and being spiritualized, and then supramentalized, allows the higher transcendental Satchitananda to become part of this world of the embodied being.
Thank you so much. That was one line. And that is why it is so important for us to go very slowly through Savitri. We begin to discover more and more as we take our time reading Savitri. The next line, earth grew too narrow for his victory. This is Ashwapati, Sri Aurobindo's victory. And so he uses that line of the divine dwarf towering to unconquered worlds to tell us that earth itself grew too narrow for his victory. Once only registering the heavy tread of a blind power on human littleness, life now became a sure approach to God. Existence, a divine experiment, and cosmos, the soul's opportunity. I'd like to go back a little bit to the word register. Once only registering the heavy tread. Well, registering is recording. So this heavy tread has been recorded by a blind power on human littleness. Now, this power is also capitalized. So we need to see what Sri Aurobindo says on power. In the letters on yoga, he says, power means strength and force, Shakti, which enables one to face all that can happen and to stand and overcome, also to carry out what the divine will proposes. It can include many things: power over men, events, circumstances, means, etc. But all this not of the mental or vital kind, but by an action through unity of consciousness with the divine and with all things and beings. It is not an individual strength depending on certain personal capacities, but the divine power using the individual as an instrument. Mother tells us that the most usual form of power is control over things, person, events, forces. And then lastly, in the letters on yoga again, Sri Aurobindo says, the use of the word power has already been explained. It can be applied to whatever or whoever exercises a conscious power in the cosmic field and has authority over the world movement or some movement in it. And not to be at all political, but to remind you that there are powers of darkness working in the world today. We have to be aware of them, and we have to counteract them with the purity of the divine force within us. Change cannot happen unless we change. Now, we continue. The world was a conception and a birth. of spirit in matter into living forms. And I probably should stop here for a moment because there's so much to share. And I don't know how much we've done, so you remind me if you don't want to hear definitions that have been done before. But the word conception here is an origin or a beginning. It's the act of conceiving something, the state of being conceived. It can be something conceived in the mind. It can be a plan, a concept, a design, an idea, even a thought. So Sri Aurobindo tells us that the world was a conception and a birth. A birth of what? Of spirit in matter, and then into living forms. Have we done definitions of spirit before? If not, I would like to go into it because it is so relevant to this line of spirit in matter into living forms. Sri Aurobindo writes, again in the letters on yoga, the spirit is the consciousness above mind, the Atman, or self, which is always in oneness with the divine. And in the essays on the Gita, he writes, what we mean by spirit is self-existent being with an infinite power of consciousness and unconditioned delight in its being. Oh, how beautiful. And back to letters on yoga. The spirit is an essential entity or consciousness which does not need to think or perceive, either in the mental or the sensory way, because whatever knowledge it has is direct or essential knowledge. In the Life Divine, he shares with us, spirit is the soul and reality of that which we sense as matter. Matter is a form and body of that which we realize as spirit. So powerful, so very powerful. I'd like to read it again. Spirit is the soul and reality, that is S-O-U-L, soul and reality of that which we sense as matter. Matter is a form and body of that which we realize as spirit. And in the human cycle, he says, the nature of the spirit is a spacious inner freedom and a large unity into which each man must be allowed to grow according to his own nature. And then in the synthesis of yoga, he writes, spirit is the crown of universal existence. Matter is its basis. Mind is the link between the two. Spirit is that which is eternal. Mind and matter are its workings. Spirit is that which is concealed and has to be revealed. Mind and body are the means by which it seeks to reveal itself. And just a few more. The spirit is the supreme being in his infinite consciousness, and the supreme nature is the infinity of power or will of being of the spirit. And then he writes in essays in philosophy and yoga, The spirit is the truth of our being. Mind and life and body, in their imperfection, are its masks, but in their perfection should be its molds. And lastly, in the Life Divine, he writes, spirit is a final evolutionary emergence because it is the original involutionary element and factor. I think we have done matter before. Have we defined matter before from Sri Aurobindo? Can anyone tell me?
Yes, we did.
Good, very good. And nature, well, let me go back a little bit because we want to make the connection properly. The world was a conception and a birth of spirit in matter into living forms. And nature, capital N, bore the immortal, capital I, in her womb. And nature bore the immortal in her womb. I think we've done nature previously also. That she might climb through him to eternal life. Oh, so beautiful. Now let's feel the music in this and the rhythm. The world was a conception and a birth of spirit in matter into living forms. Well, you see, at the end of each line, and I've discussed this very often with Amal Kiran, there has to be the briefest pause, because each line, as I said before, is a thing in itself. So we say the world was a conception and a birth of spirit in matter. No, that doesn't work. The world was a conception and a birth of spirit in matter into living forms. And there was no comma there. The comma comes only after forms. And then, to continue, Sri Aurobindo writes, and nature, capital N, bore the immortal in her womb. Well, yes, nature bears the immortal in her womb, in matter. And then he says, why did she do this? That she might climb through him to eternal life. And now we see what happens in this extraordinary canto, the yoga of the soul's release. His being lay down in bright, immobile peace, and bathed in wells of pure spiritual light. It wandered in wide fields of wisdom self, lit by the rays of an everlasting sun. His being lay down in bright, immobile peace, and bathed in wells of pure spiritual light. It wandered in wide fields of wisdom self, lit by the rays of an everlasting sun. Even his body's subtle self within could raise the earthly parts towards higher things and feel on it the breath of heavenlier air. Look how he's progressing so rapidly. He speaks of the subtle body in the synthesis of yoga in this way. The terminology of yoga recognizes, besides the status of our physical and vital being, termed the gross body, and doubly composed of the food sheath and the vital vehicle, besides the status of our mental being, termed the subtle body, and singly composed of the mind sheath or mental vehicle, a third, supreme and divine status of supramental being, termed the causal body, and composed of a fourth and a fifth vehicle, which are described as those of knowledge and bliss. I don't think anyone in the history of the earth thus far has explained this so perfectly. Even his body's subtle self within could raise the earthly parts towards higher things and feel on it the breath of heavenlier air. And I think probably we'll stop there, because then we go into a longer session in the next page and the next lines that will come. If there are any questions, Vladimir and I will attempt to answer them. If you can read something, even a few lines of Savitri every day, it will bring you into a light and an understanding that will grow almost exponentially in your consciousness. Because Mother has been very clear about this, and I could just take a moment to tell you that she has said that we should read Sri Aurobindo not by reading all of his works, but by subject. So you can read what he has said on the vital, on the physical, on the mind. And this is what I have tried to do in my, excuse me, but rather humble presentation of Savitri. I'm not a glib speaker, but I'm grateful to be able to share the little that he gives me with you. Namaste. Namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste, Narad. Thank you.